As of this moment, the report of the President's Commission is public record.
15 seconds after the Warren Commission report went public, CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite summed it up.
Who killed John F. Kennedy? The Commission answers unequivocally, Lee Harvey Oswald. Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The Commission answers he acted alone.
But even from the day the president was shot, most Americans had their doubts. In a 1963 Gallup poll taken the week of the assassination, when asked if some group or element was also responsible for the killing, more than half of U.S. adults said yes. In the absence of official information, rumors took root. The most common were that the mob was behind it, or the CIA, or Fidel Castro. Just this year, former New York Times reporter Philip Sheenan revealed that the Warren Commission went so far as to send a man to question Castro face-to-face.
Did Lee Harvey Oswald shoot President Kennedy? CBS News concludes that he did.
In the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations confirmed Oswald's involvement, but left the door open for the possibility of another gunman.
Secret Service men all around.
The conspiracy theory has been kept alive by other revelations over the years, like a reported plot to kill Kennedy in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas. But few things fueled Americans' belief in a conspiracy more than this.
Once you conclude the magic bullet could not create all 7 of those wounds?
In his 1991 film, JFK, director Oliver Stone made what might be the best-known case against the Warren Commission report.
And by definition, there had to be a conspiracy.
22 years later, Stone is still convinced he's right.
Governments lie. And everything we've learned since 1991 when the film came out has reinforced the notion that the governments have not been straight with us.
Do you see conspiracies in everything?
No, not in everything. We have conspiracies, but we also have actions that happen randomly, and accidents do happen.
Could it just be that we can't wrap our minds around the idea that the most powerful man in the world could be taken out by a nobody?
But I can wrap my mind around that, sure. McKinley was taken out by an anarchist. Lincoln was taken out by, he was taken out by a conspiracy, but John Wilkes Booth was a totally emotional man. Assassinations are often done by loners.
But not in this case.
I don't believe so in this case because of all the evidence around Dealey Plaza that day, and the autopsy, and the gun, and the bullet, and 1,000 little reasons that I'm trying to tell you, too.
And Stone didn't stop with his JFK movie. His 12-hour documentary series, The Untold History of the United States, which aired on the CBS-owned cable network Showtime, fills in the gaps, as he sees them, in the rest of the 20th century.
Dwight Eisenhower put the world on a glide path towards annihilation with the most gargantuan expansion of military power in history.
But Stone says we'll likely never have definitive proof of what happened in Dallas.
You don't think we will ever know?
I don't think it's going to be a smoking gun like you think it is, but I do think if you go to the negatives and you add them up, your logic will lead you, like Sherlock Holmes said, to a deduction. And that deduction is that he was removed.
By more than one man?
Yes. Yes, by more than one man. He was removed by our government. Not the entire government, I'm sorry. By certain elements in the CIA, I believe, control this operation. They're very good at this game.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came?
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
We saw?
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died.
Ah!
He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it.
Period. Period. Period.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. World. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 005, Jim DiEugenio and the JFK Assassination. As I've alluded to on the MidnightRiderNews.com website, the JFK assassination field can often be split into factions dependent on someone's pet theory or someone's bane. Those with whom you agree or disbelieve can often have you placed or labeled into a certain camp, a practice which is completely unsolicited by you personally. Then there are researchers like Jim DiEugenio. Jim is trusted and respected by most everyone in the JFK research community. His encyclopedic knowledge of the case is both uncanny and what many would even say is unparalleled. We're honored to have him here tonight on the Midnight Rider News Show. But before we do, I'd like to introduce one of the newest members of the Midnight Rider News team. His name is Brian Lloyd. Brian, how are you doing tonight?
Very good, ST. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Hey Brian, we're so glad to have you on board. Now, I'd like the listeners to know that I personally sought you out and asked you to be on the team. I think you'll bring some exceptional skills and knowledge to the table, and I know you'll be an important part of both the site and the show. So, first, can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are, where your interests lie, and what you'll be doing for Midnight Rider News?
Sure. Well, let me first say that I'm honored to have been asked. You said those very kind words. I would say, just from the very beginning, originally, I'm from rural New England. I studied in college, political science and history. I've always been kind of a voracious history reader. To me, fiction is almost silly because nonfiction is almost crazier than you could create. So I've always been fascinated by history, whether it's ancient, Middle Ages, or current, which would include things like the assassination and so forth. I then got a law degree here in Washington, where I've been practicing law for about 20 years, doing mostly civil litigation, although I did do some criminal defense early on. What got me into this? I would say even as a youngster, I really never believed the Lee Harvey Oswald story, and I always just kind of assumed he was framed. Of course, I've came up in a time of 3 television stations, but from time to time there would be a Kennedy thing, if I recall, and I was always creeped out by it and just assumed it was fishy. And so I came into it, without really any knowledge, but not favoring the Warren Commission conclusions. And then one day I was in an airport and I got a paperback copy of Garrison's On the Trail of the Assassinations, and this was before the internet. And I became fascinated, and I began collecting all the old books, the Warren Commission set and full volumes, early newspapers and magazines, and I had very rare video and interviews at a time prior to YouTube, which was quite large, of things that are now kind of more available, but at the time they were pretty rare. And I generally kept up with the assassinations and that type of thing. But studying John F. Kennedy necessarily leads you to RFK and Martin Luther King and Watergate and Iran-Contra, CIA and drugs, Jonestown, Waco, Iraq, 9/11, the list goes on. At least that was the progression for me. So I wound up really putting some time into all of those issues. And I would say finally, I kind of try to look at things like an attorney. I avoid conjecture and theories, and I only stick to what can be proven. And, I may be different from other researchers in that regard, but I'm not wedded to any theory. And just finally, on the Kennedy assassination itself, I'm not here to solve the mystery for you. It's my personal belief that even a first-year law student would have gotten an acquittal of Lee Harvey Oswald based on the fact that he simply wasn't upstairs shooting. He was seen before and after on lower floors, and he didn't fire a rifle. So Oswald wasn't a shooter. And secondly, there were multiple shots into the motorcade, and that can be established beyond any doubt. So those are the two things that I could absolutely prove, and that would be enough for an acquittal. And I think that's enough. I don't need to place officers here or there, or any given shooter, or James Files, for example, is in vogue. I don't know about any of that. I just know that I could get an acquittal of Oswald. So, that's the position I take.
Now, you've been involved in a special project over the last year or so. Would you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Sure. I was asked to be part of John Barber's second film. He did, in around 1991 or 2, the Garrison tapes, which came in the wake of Oliver Stone's JFK. And it was, at the time, one of the better, if not the best, documentaries that came out, because there was a flurry of them that came out following that Stone film. But they were based on some 3 hours of interviews that John Barber did with Jim Garrison. And so he's basically come out with another, maybe a part 2, you may call it. But this one's called The American Media, JFK and the Second Assassination of President Kennedy. And so it focuses on the media. In other words, JFK was assassinated. This is about how the media continued this narrative, which few people believe, and has really been undermined from the evidence that's come out since 53 years ago. It really is apropos in this fake news world, where you talk about and you focus on networks that really put their necks at stake, holding up the lone nut story. And it's really, it's its own story of Kennedy was killed, and then these people will cling to this story no matter what, even as disprovable as it is.
Well, once again, we'd like to welcome Brian Lloyd to the Midnight Rider News team. Have a good night, Brian. JFK, Watergate, Waco, the October surprise, Obama, Trump, and yes, Pizzagate. If you missed it, go to MidnightRiderNews.com and listen to episode 004 of the Midnight Rider News Show, Hidden History with Donald Jeffries.
Hi, this is Donald Jeffries, author of Hidden History and Survival of the Richest. You're listening to my friend S.T. Patrick on the Midnight Rider News Show.
Jim DiEugenio has been at the forefront of JFK assassination scholarship for close to 25 years. The Oliver Stone film JFK prompted Jim to look further into the case of New Orleans DA Jim Garrison. The resulting work was Jim's first book, Destiny Betrayed, in 1992. A greatly revised version of that book was released in 2012. Jim then co-authored and edited the Assassinations, Probe magazine on JFK, RFK, MLK, and Malcolm X. Jim had co-edited Probe magazine from 1993 to 2000. In 2013, Jim released Reclaiming Parkland, a critical analysis of Vincent Bugliosi's reclaiming history and the CIA's influence in Hollywood. Jim's work can now be read at kennedysandking.com. All of Jim's works and links to Jim's books can be found at midnightridernews.com. Our guest tonight is Jim DiEugenio. Jim, how are you doing tonight?
Fine.
Jim, you've been an important author and researcher in the JFK assassination field for some time now. I'm curious as to how your interest was sparked, what your inspiration was, and when you became involved.
All right. Well, this is a kind of interesting story. Many years ago, when I was going to film school out here in California, my partner asked me, "Why don't you write a movie script?" And so I said, "Okay." And so I searched around for an idea, and I had done a little bit of work on the JFK case up until that time, but not a lot of work. Okay, but I was just a little bit familiar with it. More than your average person, but not anywhere near where I'm at today. All right, and so I decided to go ahead and attempt that. And the more I looked at the material, the only way you could tell the story, I thought at that time, was through Jim Garrison. Okay, because he actually had this 2-year-long investigation. He actually indicted somebody, and there was a trial. So you had a pretty neat structure for a film, I thought. All right. And so I started to really get into that. And then around, I think, 87 or 88 or 89 in there, I picked up Variety magazine, and I saw that Oliver Stone had optioned on a trilogy, Assassins. Okay, it must have been 89 because that's when the book came out. All right, and so once I read that, I go, well, there goes my idea, because there's no way in the world I'm going to beat this guy to the screen. All right, and so then I decided to go ahead and put my stuff into a book, and I managed to find a publisher, and that's the first edition of Destiny Betrayed, which was not a bad book for its time, but there's been so many files released on the Garrison phenomenon that I decided to redo the book. And so if anybody's interested in looking at it, buy the second edition, because that has about, I'd say, 75% more material, okay, and more current material having to do with Garrison, and also to a lesser degree on Kennedy, okay? And so, in fact, I actually think that's my best book right now. All right. So that's essentially how I got started in this. And then after my book came out, I started getting invited to these conferences. And for the first several years, I was more or less doing stuff on Jim Garrison. All right. But then as other people got into that field, like Joan Mellon and Bill Davey, I transitioned out of it, okay? And about the last 4 years, what I've been doing is excavating John F. Kennedy's foreign policy, which, if you can believe it, because in the assassination field, until I started doing this, all anybody was interested in was Vietnam and Cuba, which is okay, all right? But the more I got into this, the more I began to see that there was a lot more to Kennedy's foreign policy than just Vietnam and Cuba. And so I began to go ahead and explore that. And for about the last 3.5, 4 years, that's mostly what I've been talking about. Although there was an exception over the weekend. I did do something on Vietnam at this conference in Virginia. Okay, but that was a comparative thing, because I wanted to show how different Kennedy's foreign policy was from Johnson and Nixon's.
Now, for those in our audience who may not know, you have a friendship with Oliver Stone, and he was the director of JFK, which was released in 1991. What was your first reaction to his film JFK? How has it impacted the field of JFK assassination research, and how did you develop a friendship with Oliver Stone?
All right. The impact of JFK was probably the biggest thing in the field since the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was about 15 years previous. All right. And it was phenomenal for the one incredible reason is that I had never seen a movie attacked as often and as far in advance as that film was. If you recall, the attacks on the film began over 7 months in advance of his premiere. I think his premiere was on December the 15th, 1991, and the attacks on the film began in May in a Chicago newspaper and in the Washington Post. And they were really vicious attacks, all right? And this went all the way up until the film premiered. Then when the film premiered, it went to DEFCON 5, all right, the controversy. So this whole controversy about the movie lasted for about 10 months. It was really incredible because in that period, if you recall, the JFK case was back in the media. I mean, there were television specials, there were newspaper responses, there were radio programs, and it was really an incredible phenomenon. And then what happened, I believe, is that the establishment said, we've got to stop this. And so at the 30th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in 1993, you had case closed. All right, this guy who essentially came out of nowhere, Gerald Posner, got the most phenomenal, most unbelievable publicity buildup. Being an author, I know you can't buy that kind of publicity. It was backed by a guy named Bob Loomis, who was an editor at Random House, and a guy named Harold Evans, who at that time was the president of Random House. And they went ahead and used all their formidable connections to map out this terrific publicity tour for Posner. And most of the time he was unopposed. Okay, he was a single talking head. And the problem is, of course, is that most people in the media don't know anything about the JFK assassination. So he's essentially allowed to say anything, And so that was essentially the beginning of the end of an equal playing field on the JFK case. Ever since then, and it's a long time, of course, over 20 years, all right, well over 20 years. You've got a mainstream media that simply will not accept anything from the critical side. And that's how they learned their lesson. They realized that the genie almost came out of the bottle when JFK came out. Because that at least created the ARB, the Assassinations Record and Review Board, which then went to work and declassified literally millions of pages of documents, most of which, not all, but most of which were ignored by the mainstream media, because there was some sensational stuff that came out of that review board, which declassified, if I remember correctly, 60,000 documents. All right? Okay? But like I said, that was, for the most part, there were maybe 2 or 3 exceptions. The media essentially ignored that stuff, even though it was very important stuff. And so that's essentially been the playing field, okay, ever since JFK came out. And it's a real shame. It's a real shame because, see, this is what I talk about, the schizophrenia of American society on the JFK case. Because as these materials came out from 1994 to 1998, they essentially backed up what the critics have been saying for years. But the more that came out, the more became the reaction is we don't want to hear it. All right, so you get this split between what the facts are versus what the mainstream media says. All right, and you get the public, which is caught in the middle, but strongly suspects that the critics are correct, but it doesn't matter. All right, to give you an example of what I'm saying, in 2013, author Larry Sabato wrote a book called The Kennedy Half Century. It's not a very good book, but the last chapter has a polling service, Hart Associates, which is a very good polling service in Washington. And they did not just polling, but focus groups, where you actually bring in people and ask them why they thought a certain thing about a subject. And there were some remarkable figures in there. Like, for example, 78% thought that Kennedy's presidency made a deep impact upon history. Now, that's a surprising stat because Kennedy was only president 2 years and 10 months. All right? I mean, you had somebody like Reagan, who was president for 8 years. You had somebody like Clinton, who was president for 8 years. You had somebody like Johnson, who was president for about 6 years. You had Nixon, who was president for... But yet, Kennedy had a deep impact, even though he was there for less than 3 years. Another one was that 91% of those polled said that something went seriously wrong with the country when Kennedy was assassinated. Now, I didn't even expect that one. That's incredible. 91% of the public thinks that something really went wrong with America after Kennedy's assassination. All right? 75% don't buy the Warren Commission. All right? The idea that Oswald killed Kennedy acting on his own. And that's a remarkable statistic because, like I said, his book came out in 2013. This is after what you had was 20 years, essentially 20 years, of the mainstream media putting nothing but Oswald did it stuff on the air. All right? Okay, so those are the kind of things that show what I'm talking about, this Jungian psychic chasm in the collective unconscious of America dealing with the JFK case. And it's not going away. All right, it's not going away.
So how was it that you developed your friendship with Oliver Stone?
Okay. When he got in contact with me to do an AV essay, an audiovisual essay, for the DVD release of JFK. All right, and I did this on it was called the New Documents. All right, and it was on the ARB releases. I think that was, if I remember correctly, that was I think 1999 or something, when a 2-set DVD came out. Okay, on JFK. And so I did one essay, and Fletcher Prouty did another one. Okay, and that's how we developed a relationship.
Well, the main storyline of Oliver Stone's JFK revolves around New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. Who is Jim Garrison, and what did you discover about him that was not in the film?
Well, it's the subject of that first book, and it's also the subject of the second edition of Destiny Betrayed, which came out, I think, in 2012. And that edition of the book was done with the benefit of the Assassinations Record Review Board declassification. And there's been a lot of stuff that the ARB declassified on the Jim Garrison case. And so some of the things that I concentrated on was, for example, the CIA's counterattack against Garrison, in which they actually labeled it the Garrison Group. There was actually a meeting of CIA bigwigs, and I think this was in the fall of 1967, and the meeting began with a guy named Ray Roca, who was James Angleton's first assistant, or who was the counterintelligence chief, saying words to the effect that if Garrison is allowed to proceed, Clay Shaw will be convicted. All right. Now, that was one of 4 meetings of this so-called Garrison Group that we have some paper on. And the odd thing is that as the meetings went on, the documentation got less and less, until by the time of the 4th meeting, there was almost no words at all in the paper. It just said 4th meeting of the Garrison Group. So when you see that with these CIA documents, what that means is, most of the time, is that they're taking it off the shelf. In other words, we're not going to have any more paper trail on this anymore. We're going to do this all behind the scenes. Okay, and that's clearly what happened. All right, because the CIA began to send in a lot of obstructions. They began to, for example, they got in contact with certain judges so that Garrison's subpoenas would not be served on certain people, like, for example, Alan Dulles. All right? And with the documentation on this is really clear now. Okay, the CIA sent lawyers out to meet with these judges to return the subpoenas unserved. Which I don't see how anybody can call that anything except an obstruction of justice. All right? And then, of course, they began to do things like wire his office for sound. For instance, that scene in JFK where they come up with the bug, that actually did happen. All right? And and it wasn't just the CIA. The FBI did it also. All right. They also wired his office for sound, and they also tapped his home phone lines, and the FBI also put a physical tail on Garrison. All right. Okay. And of course, they began to extend all this help to Clay Shaw's defense team, and believe me, they wanted it. Okay. Shaw's lawyers visited Washington at least once. They wrote a letter to Allen Dulles, all right, and they began to get help from the CIA, all right, and also at a later point in time, also through the FBI. FBI agents began doing investigations for Shaw's lawyers, if I remember correctly, about 10 days before the trial began, all right. So what we know about the Garrison investigation today is that the entire power of Washington, okay, began to go up against him. And by the way, Clay Shaw predicted this. He predicted this years before. Okay, he said to a friend that, words of the effect that people in high places would be there to help him. And they were. And by the way, it wasn't just there in Washington. They began to send people into New Orleans, okay, to go ahead and make sure that the media in the city, all right, would go ahead and disfavor Garrison just the way that the national media had done, all right. There were certain writers who were shifted off of Garrison. All right, that, for example, Hulk May and Ross Yockey, who have been fairly objective about Garrison, after they filed a story that was entitled, words of the effect, Evidence Builds for CIA, link CIA to Plot Probe, which was April, I think, of 1967, I talked to Ross Yockey later, and he told me that both him and Hulk May were taken off the Garrison beat shortly after that. All right? And so you don't do that unless somebody comes in, and says something about it. All right? And so what happened is that both the national media and the local media, in addition to all this interference I've described, began to attack Garrison. All right? And he really wasn't allowed. The only time I can think of that Garrison had a big platform to really get his message out in an unobstructed way was in the Playboy interview in the fall of 1967. All right? And then, of course, after that, he got sued, okay, for that Playboy interview. All right? But that was the only time that I can recall that he had an unobstructed platform.
I always wondered what would have happened if they would have let Garrison prosecute Shaw and actually win. Because, in essence, it would seem easier for the CIA and those involved in a cover-up to have to deal with trying to distance themselves from Clay Shaw rather than having to defend the Oswald as lone nut theory for 50 years. They could have said, look, okay, the Warren Commission was wrong, but Jim Garrison corrected it, and now we have the truth, so it's all over, right?
Well, I don't think that's a question you can answer because nobody knows what would... See, Garrison essentially had planned on, at the beginning, on a series of trials, all right? Ferry, Shaw, and then go on from there. But of course we know that Ferry died mysteriously, all right, and the Shaw prosecution was obstructed in every single way you can imagine. But from what I've been able to garner is that he wanted to, once these guys were convicted, he wanted to start dealing with them. All right? Okay, in other words, will you give us some information, et cetera, that kind of thing. All right. Now, whether or not that would have worked, I don't know how anybody can predict if that would have worked or not. We really don't know that. All right. But for them, for the other side, what they did, of course, is that once Garrison was sunk, all right, and once the perjury charges against Shaw were thrown out, then what came into effect was a giant discreditation of Garrison. All right, and on top of that, they prosecuted him a couple of times, and that was all, as I say in my book, the second edition of Destiny Betrayed. In my opinion, that was all part of an objective that had been laid out years before, because one of the orders of the Garrison group by Richard Helms was that he wanted to figure out a strategy for before, during, and after the Shaw trial. All right? So that's what these guys do. They think that far out in advance. All right? And so the strategy after the Shaw trial was to discredit the entire prosecution, all right, that it should have never came to trial, that Clay Shaw was essentially Prince Charming, and Garrison was a little loony, and everything about his case was fruity, all right? And then what they were going to do was to do everything they could to get him out of office, all right, which they eventually did. The two prosecutions, the first one he got by on, the second one was the one that he lost the election by about 2,000 votes. Then, once he was removed from office, they got their ally, Harry Connick, who was working for the Justice Department on Clay Shaw's side, during the trial. And they got him to go ahead and actually start incinerating the evidence. See, and this is really, I believe, the worst thing that could have happened, because only I've gone through what's left of Garrison's files. I've been one of the very few people who's been allowed to do that. All right. And I would say that what we have today, what's in the National Archives, is maybe at the most 40% of what Garrison actually had. So in other words, about 60% of the investigation is lost to history forever. And that's really a shame. But that was their objective. All right? And so you had the spectacle of, and by the way, this didn't come out until the ARB went to New Orleans. It surfaced that, Connick, who succeeded Garrison as DA, actually incinerated some of the files. And then, of course, when that story came out, the New York Times came in. They sent in Gerald Posner to interview Connick to do a patch-up job on him. All right? Now, in addition to the incineration of a large part of Garrison's files, there is also the fact that Garrison's investigation was infiltrated by CIA agents, and they walked off a lot with his files. For example, Bill Boxley, who I talk about a lot in the second edition of Destiny Betrayed. Then I found out through some correspondence between Garrison and Zachary Sklar, who was one of the co-writers of the screenplay for JFK, that Garrison had entrusted, I think, 3 file cabinets of his stuff to a friend, and then that had disappeared. All right? So that's why I say, a large part of what we know about Garrison's investigation has been simply lost to history. And that's really pretty terrible. But that was their objective. See, because the whole rubric that they wanted to put on this was that Garrison really didn't have anything. This was all done for publicity. This was all done for career advancement, which when you think about it is pretty stupid, because if you take a look at Garrison in 1966, and I actually have a chapter in the second edition of Destiny Betrayed is titled that, Jim Garrison in 1966. See, Garrison at that time was one of the 3 or 4 most powerful politicians in the state. Okay? He was so powerful that he was able to help elect the governor, all right, of the state, John McKeithen, all right? And McKeithen actually asked them to run for him, with him as lieutenant governor in 1968, and Garrison turned it down. He was too much involved in the JFK case, all right? But Garrison could have easily, if he would have accepted that offer, he would have been the next governor of the state. But his ambition, of course, was to be a senator. That's what he wanted to do. So at the beginning of the investigation, Garrison had an almost unlimited horizon of what he could have done in state politics. It was what he did with the Kennedy case that destroyed his career. And he didn't really recover for about 10 years, because I know people who visited him in that time period, and he was relegated to renting like a small office, as off of a large law firm. Okay, he was a single practitioner, and he was renting a small, like 400-foot office at that time. It wasn't until he got elected to the courts, or the state court system, that he's able to rehabilitate his career. And then, of course, he wrote that book. All right, and then Oliver Stone was presented with the book by the publisher, okay, Ellen Ray, at that film festival in Havana, and then he decided to go ahead and buy the book and make the film, and that's essentially kind of restored Jim Garrison, and it made people take another look at his case again.
Right, it sure has. Now, the 1960s were a tumultuous time for political assassinations, and your second work, appropriately entitled The Assassinations, dealt with JFK as well as the assassinations of RFK, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. In working with these 4 as a tandem, or in tandem, what did you learn as a researcher and an author?
All right, well, that's an interesting question, because going into when we started publishing Probe magazine, all right, which was in 1993, all right, I was only interested in the JFK case. And I remember doing a show around that time period when we began. And the host of the show told me he had booked me for an interview in New York City. And he said, "You're going to be our guy in the JFK case, and we're also going to do RFK and King." And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, we're going to do RFK and King. They were both conspiracies." And I remember hanging up the phone and saying, "Boy, there's a lot of fruitcakes in this world." Okay, and I could only say that because at that time I didn't know very much about those 2 cases. But as time went on and we began to expand Probe magazine, all right, I began to learn that, well, the guy was right. All 3 of them were conspiracies, And so if you take a look at the 3 cases, but whichever order you want to take them in, there's certain characteristics, that are similar, or let's put them, if they're not exactly similar, they roughly correspond to each other. Okay, obviously the first one is the single patsy, okay, the single assassin who's supposed to go ahead and done the assassination. And there's the mischaracterization, the character smears that come in to make the guy into a murderer. When in fact, if you take a look at the background of all 3 of these guys, there's very little evidence that would make you think that the guy had a penchant to kill. All right? And then there's, of course, the way that the legal mechanism simply breaks down, by hook or by crook. All right. In the case of Oswald, they simply got rid of him. They're on national television, like with God knows how many policemen in the lobby, the Dallas Police Headquarters, Jack Ruby somehow miraculously comes in and shoots him live on TV. Which, if I had enough time, I'd go into why that's not the way it appears, but that's what the public saw. And then, of course, you get the non-defense of James Earl Ray. See, not very many people know that. James Earl Ray didn't have a trial. Okay? And so, he was essentially intimidated into pleading guilty. And he made a couple of interesting comments during that proceeding, which made other people get interested in his case. And then there's, of course, Sirhan, whose attorney, Grant Cooper, never argued the evidence. See, that's a lot of people don't know that. At the trial of Sirhan for the assassination of Robert Kennedy, there was never any discussion of the evidence in that case, because there's a legal term in court proceedings. It's called stipulate. All right? If the defense counsel stipulates to the evidence, that means he's not going to argue the evidence in the case. So what they were arguing for was that Sirhan was somehow mentally impaired, okay, which didn't work at all, and which a guy who would examine Sirhan called it the forensic psychological blunder of the century. All right, okay, and so when people talk about Sirhan's conviction, it really wasn't a conviction. All right, and that's why, of course, they were not about to give him a retrial. When Laurie Dusek and William Pepper tried to get Sirhan a new trial a few years ago, I happened to read the briefs in that, and believe me, if they would have given Sirhan a new trial, he would have walked. Okay? So they were ultimately denied their chance for a new trial of Sirhan. Believe me, they don't want to do that. And by the way, the same thing happened in the King case. When William Pepper was about to get a new criminal trial for James Earl Ray, all hell broke loose in Memphis, and they put a halt to the rifle testing, because they couldn't get a match, and so they kept on trying to do it over and over, and finally the judge in the case, Judge Joe Brown, said, all right, why don't we run a liquid lubricant through the rifle barrel, and that will clean it out without harming the insides of it. Then we'll run the rifle test, and we'll figure out once and for all if that was the rifle that was used to kill King. Well, when he said he was going to do that, that was it. The whole city blew up. He was taken off the case, and Pepper had to instead go for a civil trial, which thankfully the King family agreed to do, and which Pepper won. All right, but this is, by the way, after the state of Tennessee made sure that Ray was not around for that, because Ray had a very severe case of liver cirrhosis, and the University of Pittsburgh, or a hospital in Pittsburgh, had offered to do a transplant, and the Tennessee authorities wouldn't let him go. All right, and so he passed away, so he couldn't testify on the legal stand in his own civil trial. So those are some of the relations. But let me add one more thing. I'll never forget on a show that Johnny Carson did, I think it was in 1968, Truman Capote was on, either 68 or 69. And in thinking about those cases, he had a very telling comment to make. All right? He said, John, I'm a writer. I've been a writer all my life. I know many writers. Okay? Neither I nor any of my friends keeps a diary. All right? But if you look at these guys, they all keep diaries, even though none of them even graduated from high school.
Right.
Okay? So it's all very convenient, okay, when it comes out,
right,
that they all did diaries. Isn't that rather odd?
Oh, gosh.
Yes,
it is.
All right.
What's always sort of struck me as interesting or even intriguing, is that the King family fully backs the idea that it was not James Earl Ray, yet the Kennedy family has been somewhat silent on the matter over the years. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, let me put it this way. In my opinion, if you ask them privately what they think, I think they would say they don't think Oswald acted alone. But it's very hard for them to say that in public, because until a few years ago, of course, the death of Ted Kennedy, the Kennedy family was still pretty prominent on the national scene. All right? And I know, although I can't reveal it in this interview, I know that that's one of the main reasons that they have not gone public on this, because they know that their, whatever status they have in the society would immediately be negated and mischaracterized, if they did so, if they got out in front of the case. Now, if you take a look at David Talbot's book, Brothers, that was, I think it was published around, 2007 or something like that. All right. That's a pretty good investigation about the way Bobby Kennedy actually felt about the JFK assassination. And I think that book does a pretty good job of showing that Bobby Kennedy never bought the official story, not even from the very first day, about this whole Oswald thing, And he was secretly working behind the scenes to develop his own inquiry into the case. And by all the evidence that he advances there, he very likely would have reopened the case if he became president, which he probably would have in 1968. I mean, most of the indicators there were that, Bobby Kennedy would have probably won the nomination in Chicago. And instead, the Democratic Party essentially split itself asunder in Chicago. That unbelievable violence that took place, outside the convention center, where I think you can pretty much say, historically speaking, that the Democratic Party split itself in two, over the Johnson-Humphrey wing and the Bobby Kennedy wing, because the Bobby Kennedy wing didn't have anybody representing them anymore once he was assassinated. All right, and that was really an incredible milestone in political history. All right, the whole tearing apart, and of course the Republicans took advantage of this. They very much took advantage of this. Kennedy, once Robert Kennedy was dead, Richard Nixon understood what was happening. And if you read any biographies about the guy, you'll see that he definitely wanted to go ahead and widen that split in the Democratic Party. So therefore, he started his whole Southern strategy to cater to the South, with judicial appointments and to work the white backlash on civil rights. And then through Charles Colson, he even employed hard hat union guys to go ahead and attack student demonstrators against the Vietnam War. So they're very, very aware of that. And by the way, not so many people know this stuff because, speaking of Richard Nixon, once Nixon resigned from office, and again, not very many people know this, once he resigned from office, with the help of his buddy Jerry Ford, they worked a deal where he would have control of his presidential papers and tapes, to the point that he could even incinerate them if he wanted to. Well, once that hit the fan, Congress passed a law that said those papers and tapes must revert to the National Archives. Well, Richard Nixon didn't like that. So he went ahead and hired a fleet of lawyers, and they contested that law. And this went on for the rest of Nixon's life, 20 years, till 1994 when he died. And so it wasn't until then, and his heirs got a settlement from the government, if you can believe that, how a guy can be forced to resign from office and then his heirs get a settlement from the government for his papers and tapes. It's just amazing to me. But it happened. All right? And so then, it was only then that stuff began to be declassified about the Nixon presidency. At the time of his death, only 3% of the tapes and only 15% of the papers had been declassified. All right? But now the more that comes out, I mean, the worse this guy looks. And see, and if you understand that, and you understand who Bobby Kennedy was in 1968, it was really a great loss for the country.
Yes, it was.
A tremendous loss for the country.
Yes, it was. I really think RFK would have won, and I really think he would have been a fine man to have in office. So on to the subject of the mainstream media and their desire to continue, no surprise, the Oswald acted alone theory. Whether it's been O'Reilly or Stephen King or, as you've written about extensively, Vincent Bugliosi and Tom Hanks, the media seems still determined to wage a propaganda war against anyone who even suggests a conspiracy. But as your friend Lisa Pease wrote, not all conspiracies are theories. And your work Reclaiming Parkland uncovered some amazing facts regarding Hank's efforts at explaining what happened at Parkland Hospital. What exactly did you find out in researching Reclaiming Parkland?
All right. To give you some background on this, when Vincent Bugliosi's book came out, entitled Reclaiming History, that book was approximately 2,500 pages long if you include the CD, okay, because Vince originally planned that as a 3-volume set, all right? And his publisher said, Vince, who the heck is going to buy the Warren Commission in 3 volumes again? You know? All right. And so they did a deal that the book would be oversized, which it is, all right, and then it would contain a CD in it, all right, which has, if you can believe it, it's about 900 pages on the CD, in addition to all the pages in the book. And so I was probably one of the 5 or 6 people in the whole country who actually sat there at my computer and I read the entire book with the CD open in front of me on the screen. All right? And I liked Vince personally. I talked to him several times on the phone. But I could not believe what he had done with this book. Okay? It is really a very bad book. And the thing about it is, you can only understand how bad it is if you really know the JFK case. Because Vince was a very bright and clever guy, you know. And the way he made his case was, let's put it this way. The stuff that he thought that he could counter effectively, he did so in the text of the book. The stuff he thought he would have problems with, he put on the CD. Now, how many people do you think were going to read the CD? Okay. All right. And so then, the stuff that he knew he couldn't counter at all, he just left out of the book. That's what his strategy was. All right. And it's a very clever strategy. All right. So, and along with that, he began this long string of invective, which is a part of the book, that he was going to smear the critics, you know, mischaracterize them, caricature them. So that book is really an argument by length and by invective. All right, that's what really it's all about. And so I began to write about it, and that's how we came up with Reclaiming Parkland. All right. Now, when I learned that Tom Hanks and his partner Gary Goldsman were going to go ahead and make a mini-series about this, I began to do a little bit of work, you know, on Hanks. And it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. There isn't that much out there about Hanks, but I dug up a biography of him. And he doesn't come from the whole all-American background that he tries to convey. You know, his father and his first wife split up. His father then married again, divorced again. All right, and he didn't really find himself, he says, until he became part of a fundamentalist church in the San Francisco, Oakland area. You know, and he says that kind of really saved him because it gave him an anchor. Okay? And then he got into acting. But the more I learned about Hanks, and I kind of parallel this with Spielberg, okay? As young men, they were outsiders who wanted to become insiders. They desperately wanted to become insiders, okay? And that's what they did. Okay, that's what they did. They became insiders, and they decided they were going to back the Democratic Party, no matter what it stood for. And that's how they're big contributors to the Clintons, big contributors to the Obamas. Okay, but yet, wouldn't you think that would be odd? That Hanks would then go ahead and buy a book and want to make a miniseries that essentially covered up the truth about Kennedy. Isn't that kind of bizarre? You know, but that's what I concluded. This was his way of becoming an insider. And their favorite historian, of course, was Stephen Ambrose. All right, the Nixon biographer, who has pretty much been discredited. And I summarized that whole thing in Reclaiming Parkland. You know how Ambrose was later found out to have made up interviews with Dwight Eisenhower. And it was that book that made him a big deal. All right? And that's the kind of historian they follow. You know, and so that's one of the reasons I wrote that book. And in the last part of the book, it has 3 parts. You know, one I deal with Bugliosi and Hanks, and the trial, the London trial that started the book, because Bugliosi went up against Jerry Spence in 1986 in a mock TV trial. All right, and by the way, that's the only mock trial where the prosecution won. Okay, there's been about 7 of them. That's the only one that they won. And so I analyzed how bad that trial was. In the second part of the book, I analyzed reclaiming history. And in the third part of the book, I deal with the CIA in Hollywood, okay, which is a subject that very few people, actually the CIA and the Pentagon in Hollywood, their influence, which, now I don't know if this is a coincidence or not, but they began to set up an office right after JFK came out, all right? And I analyzed that, okay? There's a very good book by a female professor called The CIA in Hollywood, which I largely based on that, all right? And what they did after JFK came out was a very conscious and deliberate switching around of what you would expect, you know, directors and screenwriters and actors to want to be a part of, you know, and they really did a great, you know, as much as I don't like it, you know, I have to congratulate them on what they did, you know, because they had 2 guys there for a period, if I recall, of about, and you can pick up the book if you want to get the details, yeah, for a period of about 12 years, all right, and then they didn't need anybody else because they had done what the CIA always wants to do, is to set up their own self-sustaining project. That's how much they succeeded, you know. And when they went in, the guy running the project said he was sick and tired of, you know, all these movies about CIA rogue agents, you know, who run wild and then want to overthrow the government, you know, and the people believe this, and that's what he was set out to do, to reverse that trend. And that's what he did. And I chronicle it in the last part of that book. And I believe that, you know, that Hanks is a part of that mentally. Okay, that's his makeup. He always, when he was growing up, you know, he always liked to watch that TV show Biography. All right? To him, that was a great way to deal with history. To me, I really don't think that show was all that sensational, you know, but he greatly admired it. And so when he became a big star, all right, and he was able to produce things, that's the kind of history he produced. You know, that whole thing about from the Earth to the Moon, he thought that was just sensational. Okay, how the United States, you know, went ahead and did the Apollo project and landed on the moon. He thought that was one of the great moments in modern American history. For some people, it was. You know, for some people, you know, you think, well, it didn't end up very well, did it, with the Challenger disaster? You know, and there was a ton of money to spend, you know, and what did we do with the moon anyway? You know, you know, I mean, yeah. You know, and so, but for him, that was the high point of America in the 1960s. You know, somebody like me coming from a different angle, I believe that King's I Have a Dream speech was the American high point of the 1960s. You know, all right, but that's Tom Hanks. That's Tom Hanks. That's what he wants to look for in American history. That's probably why he was attracted. But they made a movie out of it, The Band of Brothers, the Ambrose book about World War II. You know, then he did another miniseries about the Pacific. See, what happened with Hanks, though, and this is why I think he couldn't do the JFK thing, is that those projects got more and more expensive. If I remember correctly, From the Earth to the Moon was $60 million. Then The Band of Brothers was over $100 million. And then the Pacific was close to $200 million. You know, and the Pacific did not do very well in the ratings. So I think that's one of the things that, and I write about this in Reclaiming Parkland, that I think that's one of the reasons that he couldn't pull off a miniseries of reclaiming history. So instead, what happened? He optioned for this movie Parkland, okay, and Oliver likes to kid me about this. You know, Jim has to be the only guy who put the title of a book, you know, for the title of his book, put a movie that nobody saw. Okay,
right. I have to admit that I didn't see it.
And I have to say, he's probably right about that. The night I saw it, granted it was during the week, but there were like 5 people in the theater. All right. So it was a complete and utter bomb. All right, and a lot of people probably could have predicted that because it was really a pretty bad movie, you know. But you know, they got something out of it. Bugliosi made some money, you know, and you know, and it got produced, you know, and so that's what came of that. That's what came of the Tom Hanks, Bill Paxton, Gary Goetzman mad dash to do something with Bugliosi's book. And by the way, I don't mind saying this. I would bet $1,000 to each of those guys. I'm sorry, but Paxton's dead, so I couldn't do it with him. He passed away a few weeks ago. Okay, rest in peace. With Hanks and Goetzman, I would bet each of them $1,000 that neither one of them read the whole book in the CD. All right? All right? But they went ahead and bought the book and said it was this great conversion for them, you know, that somehow they had now seen the light and the JFK case was not a conspiracy, etc. You know, when in fact I would be willing to wager, you know, $1,000 for each of them that neither one of them read the book all the way through with the CD. You know, so that was my take on that phenomenon. All right, and I concluded with that book with the idea, you know, that we have a cinema today that is really kind of uninspiring compared to the cinema that I grew up with. All right. And I talk about there how the American cinema from about 1964 to 1975 was really second to none in the world for that time period. You had a whole, you know, at least a score of movies that can be seriously called classics today. You know, you had every year, you had 3 or 4. I don't even watch Academy Awards anymore because I think all those movies are crappy, you know, or at least most of them are. But back then, you know, I don't know how old your audience is, but you know, back then you had things like The Conversation, Bonnie and Clyde, The Wild Bunch, Little Big Man, Chinatown, Easy Rider, and you could go on and on, literally. Dr. Strangelove, for my money, the greatest black comedy in the history of American cinema, But you can go on and on with all these pictures, but we don't have anything like that anymore. I mean, what do you got? Wonder Woman, So that's what. Yeah, right. We become a comic book cinema, and so that's what's happened to our media, and that's why one of the reasons I think we have so many problems dealing with what's happened to this country. So that's how I ended the book. This is not the kind of cinema we need. All right. And I ended it with Newton Minow's famous speech. He was Kennedy's Federal Communications Commissioner, chairman at the time. He made one of the most famous speeches, of that era. It's called the Vast Wasteland speech, where he went in front of the television producers guild and told them, if you go, I challenge any of you to wake up early in the morning when your TV programming goes on at, say, 5 or 6 in the morning and watch it all the way until you get the end signal. Because back in those days, it wasn't 24-hour broadcasting. It would shut off around 2 in the morning. All right? And don't read a magazine. Don't read a newspaper. Just watch it every minute. And he said, what you'll see is a vast wasteland. Okay? Television, when it's good, he said, is very good. But television, when it's bad, is horrendous. All right? And so he said, and he challenged them, we can do better than this. And in my opinion, we're not doing better than that. We're not doing better than that at all. I think, the MSM, the mainstream media, has not gotten better. In some ways, it's even gotten worse. And the great hope, the so-called alternative media that began with the cable companies and online stuff, hasn't helped very much at all. It hasn't helped very much at all. It's been a tremendous disappointment. And in my opinion, that's why this country is in the situation it's in today. So anyway, that's how I ended that book. I wanted to end it on a cultural kind of a point, all right, about what this all really means.
Now, Jim, for those who think that the JFK assassination is an old story, 2017 is actually a pretty important year for JFK research, is it not?
Oh, yeah. Okay, you already had the centennial. Okay, JFK at 100, and on our website, kennedysandking.com, we have a whole 4-panel AV essay on that. Because very few people know anything about Kennedy. Because this is part of the second layer of the cover-up, I've always believed, especially in the last few years, that, what Kennedy really achieved, has been covered up as much as his assassination. All right, it's really amazing what the guy achieved in less than 3 years in office. All right, so that was the first milestone. That was May 29th. Then in October, you're going to have the final releases of the ARB, the Assassinations Record Review Board, that stopped operating in 1998. What happened there was that after the declassification process was done, there were a couple of qualifications within the law that allowed certain documents to be reserved. In other words, they would not be fully declassified. And so there was a time limit to 2017. And the qualifications were that if still an operation was ongoing, or if an agent in place was still there, all right, then the agency was allowed to reserve that document until 2017. So now that is going to be expiring in, I think the date is October the 17th. And so the last count I know of is that there's 3,400 documents that are still being held, which if you take a look at the 60,000 that were declassified, that's about 5%. But that figure might be wrong. I have someone working on that for us, okay, who's very familiar with that. And he's going to be publishing an essay at kennedysandking.com probably on Sunday about whether or not that's the correct number, or if the National Archives even knows what the correct number really is. All right? And then in November, in Houston, there's going to be a mock trial, all right, which is going to be a very good mock trial because we're going to have a couple of very good attorneys there for the first time. Larry Schnapp and Bill Simpich are going to go ahead, and for this time, they're going to be able to use all the current evidence we have, which would mean declassifications from the review board. So this should be, I think, a really good, interesting event. And we have an article on our website about that, but that'll be updated later with more information as it becomes more towards the date of its, hopefully it'll be broadcast.
I recently read that you attended 2 screenings of John Barber's new documentary, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John Kennedy. What were your impressions of the film?
Well, John is a very good guy, okay, who I like a lot personally. All right. The Garrison tapes, which was the first film of that, I thought was a pretty good picture. In fact, I think it's one of the better documentaries on the JFK case. All right. This one, he dealt with the media, which is a really big subject, okay? And God, for somebody who has that kind of ambition and somebody who went through as much trouble as he did, okay, you got to give the guy a heck of a lot of credit for taking on a subject that huge, okay? There's a few things in there that I wouldn't have recommended him putting in there. On the whole, he makes some really, for example, the thing about Bill O'Reilly was a very telling point. Okay. Have you seen it?
Yes, I saw it in November in Dallas.
Okay. That was a very telling point. Bill O'Reilly was actually on our side when he first made the big time with Inside Edition. And he actually did some good stuff. And you can still see it on YouTube. But what obviously happened, I think, is that Roger Ailes, who co-founded the company with Rupert Murdoch, Fox, obviously called him in and said, if you want to be a big deal at Fox and make this kind of money, okay, no more JFK for you. And so that's what happened. And then he actually wrote that god-awful book, Killing Kennedy, which sold about 2 million copies, if I remember. And he put that line of malarkey in there about being at George de Mohrenscheld's door when he heard the shotgun blast go off. All right, that was so stupid that in my review of the book, I didn't even mention it. But later, other people did, and they found these tapes because a lot of his information at that time was coming from Gaten Fonzie, who was an investigator for the House Select Committee, which proved pretty much beyond a shadow of a doubt that O'Reilly was not in Florida at that time at all, and he could not have been at the doorstep of George de Mohrenscheld, who I guess we should talk a little bit about. George de Mohrenscheld, to explain why this is important, George de Mohrenscheld was one of the most important figures in the entire JFK saga for more than one reason, all right? First of all, he was a pretty outstanding member of the so-called White Russian community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The White Russians were people who fled Russia after the Communist Revolution, came to the United States, and many of them were backed by the CIA because their goal was to someday return and overthrow the communist dictatorship in Moscow. So many of them had ties to the Central Intelligence Agency. All right. De Mohrenschildt was also in the oil business, okay, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he knew a lot of interesting people like George Bush, okay? All right. And thirdly, De Mohrenschildt, very strangely, becomes Oswald's best friend in Dallas when Oswald returns from the Soviet Union. All right? Now, ask yourself a simple question. What would a White Russian whose father lost a multi-million-dollar fortune in oil when the communists took over the Soviet Union, what would he be doing hanging out with this defector to Russia, all right, marries a communist wife, comes back to the United States, and is a Castro sympathizer? Now, that's not the strangest dichotomy you ever heard of, okay? It certainly strikes me as being rather odd. You know, this is one of the things that Jim Garrison said. You know, here you have this charming, handsome, you know, fairly well-off oil geologist, all right, who's chumming around with this minimum wage wastrel communist, supposed wastrel communist. You know, Garrison said, what did they talk about? Last season at Biarritz, or how to beat the bank at Monte Carlo? You know, because that's the kind of guy De Mohrenschildt was. You know, he was really a kind of world traveler, you know, and had been married 3 or 4 times, you know, and just seems such a striking opposite, you know, to Oswald. So how on earth? Well, it turns out that in the end, De Mohrenschildt finally confessed. He said words to the effect, I would have never met Oswald. Okay, never. Okay? I was called in by the CIA station chief in Dallas, J. Walton Moore, okay, and I was asked to befriend him. All right? And that's why I did it. Okay? And he was very good friends with J. Walton Moore, and he had done certain assignments for the CIA. And I guess you really wouldn't call him an agent. You really wouldn't call him an agent. The terminology would be an asset. Okay? He would do things for them from time to time, and he would get something in return. All right? And so that's the kind of relationship he had with them. And that is why he became, you know, Oswald's so-called best friend. And then, of course, De Mohrenschildt leaves the country, I think in April or May of 1963, goes to Haiti, and De Mohrenschildt then is befriended by another odd couple, Ruth and Michael Payne. All right, him and his wife, Marina, were befriended by Ruth and Michael Payne, who were another couple of members of this white Russian community, although they were not Russians. They were from back east in the United States. They were more or less members of the Eastern Establishment, which we don't have enough time to finish at, but that's another really, really strange relationship that, you know, that is puzzling to this day. You know, Oswald was the weirdest communist that ever walked the face of the earth. You know, he was a guy who hung out with the white Russian community in Dallas, again, and then when he goes to New Orleans, he hangs out with these Cuban exiles. Okay? So what kind of communist hangs out with white Russians in Dallas-Fort Worth and Cuban exiles in New Orleans? And I think that most people who study that phenomenon, you know, the conclusion is that Oswald really wasn't a communist. And that's the conclusion that Jim Garrison came to, all right, way back there in 1967, 1968. that Oswald was actually an FBI informant and a CIA agent provocateur. And one of his functions before he died was to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee on the streets of New Orleans in the summer of 1963. All right? Like a guy who was a leftist in the 1960s told me this. He goes, Jim, if you're a real communist, you don't do things like that. You don't get into downtown New Orleans and stand on a street corner and say you want to free Cuba and get fair treatment for Castro. In New Orleans, of all cities in the South, he said, when we used to do that kind of thing, we would go out at night, all right? We would go into an apartment building foyer and slide the literature under the door so that this would not offend the people in public and we would not be identified, all right? So that's what a real communist would do. And so he said, the minute he saw Oswald doing this, he said, this guy's not a real communist. They just don't act like that. You know, and there's many other, the whole idea about him being in Guy Bannister's office, which we have even more documentation on that today than we had before, because one of the things that the ARB declassified was the testimony of two INS agents, Immigration and Naturalization Service, who tracked many of the Cuban exiles who were illegally into the country, tracked them to Davis Ferry, and then tracked Ferry to 544 Camp Street, and saw that Oswald had an office there. So there's even more, witnesses on this fact today than there were back in Jim Garrison's day. And of course, I don't know if, should I explain who Guy Bannister was? As depicted in the film JFK, played by Edward Asner, Bannister was a former FBI agent who was in 1962, 1963, as far back as 1961, was doing a lot of anti-Castro work, in New Orleans, freelancing for the CIA, the FBI, had connections all over. I mean, you talk to some of the guys who worked for him, the guy was on the phone with Hoover, he was on the phone with the CIA, he was getting all kinds of contributions from the wealthy people in New Orleans, who wanted to keep his work up, And so it's very, very, very odd that on at least one, there's probably more than one, on one of Oswald's pamphlets there, that he was handing out in 1963, he put the return address 544 Camp Street, which is the address of Bannister's office. Now, if that wasn't a bombshell, I don't know what the heck was. But the thing is, try and find it in the Warren Report. Okay? Now, the FBI knew about this. All right? And they handed in reports saying that this was somehow some kind of a foul-up and that the landlord never saw Oswald there, etc. So it never, but that was obviously a cover story. The Warren Commission itself never investigated it, because when it was investigated by people like Jim Garrison and by the House Select Committee, there were all kinds of witnesses who saw Oswald there, and also some private authors. Today there's if you take a look at my book, Destiny Betrayed, the second edition, I think I put in about 11 witnesses who saw Oswald at 544 Camp Street or with Bannister. And that's very important because that gets to the whole point of who the heck was Oswald. And I think today, most people who study the guy would say that he was not a communist. And so that made him the perfect patsy. Because what happens on November 22nd, 1963, is all the stuff he's doing in New Orleans, because he was doing a lot of weird stuff there about the pamphleting, going on radio, going on TV, there were films of him. That gets blasted into the media, November 22nd and November 23rd, and then that labels him as a communist, and that provides a motive for him killing Kennedy. Of course, and then what happens, of course, on November 24th, is that he's murdered by Jack Ruby, but that gets people thinking, isn't that kind of strange? this guy, the only time he addressed a question, he said, "I'm just a patsy." Okay, that very memorable sentence, "I'm just a patsy," you know, and then the next day he's dead. Okay, so obviously the subliminal message was somebody sent Ruby in to silence him. You know, I think a lot of people, and that's why, because in 1964, when the Warren Report came out, it came out in the fall of 1964, you know, the trust in government, as polled by U.S. News and World Report, they have a famous chart, which we use in the Assassinations. It's also in Kevin Phillips' book, Arrogant Capital. It took its biggest drop in 1964. All right, Americans, because prior to that, during the Kennedy administration, it was in the high 70s. By about 1976, 1977, it had gone down to less than 15%. But the biggest drop was in 1964. And, you know, you got to wonder, because people didn't believe what the Warren Report was telling them. You know, and then it just got all worse after that, because Vietnam then blew up in 1965 when Johnson commenced the first troops there. Okay, and then Watergate, and then the exposures of the Church Committee with the crimes of the FBI and the CIA. Those three events consumed about the next 10 years. And that's why trust in government just went right down through the floorboards.
You just spoke at a national security state and JFK conference near Washington, D.C. Now, they advertised the conference as the day when Ron Paul was going to reveal his true feelings regarding the JFK assassination. So what did Ron Paul say, and was it anything of note?
Well, he said very little about it. All right, that's one of the reasons I wanted to go. I watched his speech from beginning to end, and by the way, I think it's going to be televised. Okay, I think that conference is going to be televised on C-SPAN, because there were about 3 cameras there. Yeah. It wasn't televised live. I thought it was going to be televised live. It wasn't. But the only thing that he said about that I can recall, he said whenever they put these commissions together, and he didn't say Warren Commission, but of course it's a conference about JFK. I think that's what he meant. He said you can just deduce that the opposite is true. And that was it. You know, which, okay, that's a good message. I wish he would have said a little bit more about it, though. You know.
Right, that seems like it was very underwhelming. Well, let's go to the email questions now. Question number 1. Was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone? Was he acting as part of a conspiracy, or was he not acting at all?
I don't think Oswald was acting as a conscious member of a conspiracy. I think he was a victim of a conspiracy, which he was unaware of. All right? That's after studying this case for all these years, I'm pretty sure that is what happened.
All right, email question number 2. There's a famous picture of 3 tramps or hobos that have been rumored to be names such as E. Howard Hunt, Charles Harrison, Chauncey Holt, and a lot of others. What are your ideas of who the tramps or hobos may or may not have been?
All right. This is a kind of complicated question because I've just learned from another researcher that that was not the only set of hobos that was found that day. That there was another group found. All right? And that makes it very interesting. Those 3 tramps were later identified in the Dallas archive as being just that. Okay? And there was a show on TV, about a 15-minute segment of a news show, about that because a couple of them were alive when JFK came out. But this other set, okay, is something that really hasn't been explored yet. Okay? And I'm trying to get some more information about that. So this might not be a dead issue yet. So stay tuned. Oh, let me add, if you want some information on that, the guy's name is Robin Ramsey. He's a British author, and he has a website, and he has an article about that up on his website. Okay?
All right, we'll absolutely check that out. Now, the recent hot name that seems to be in vogue is the name James Files, who reportedly has confessed to being one of the assassins. So I knew this question would be asked by email. So he was also the subject of a new I Killed JFK documentary. So the emailer wants to know, what is your opinion of the conspirator du jour, James Files?
That whole phenomenon, I do not believe is kosher. And if you want a very good essay on that, let me refer you to a guy named Alan Eaglesham, okay, who has written a very good essay on this. It's called The Telltale Dash, James Files and the Dennett Cartridge Case, by a guy named Alan Eaglesham, Eaglesham. And that's a very, very good analysis of the whole Files phenomenon, all right, which he deals with it with hard evidence there.
Last email for Jim DiEugenio. We talked earlier about Oswald's time in New Orleans. Now, there's a famous photograph from that time where Oswald is standing next to a man that many have said is Raphael Cruz, the father of Senator Ted Cruz. Do you believe that's the case?
No. And I wrote an article about that on our website, kennedysandking.com, and it pretty much discredits that idea. All right? So just go there and then look up, Trump and the 2016 election, and you'll find that article which I discussed that issue.
Okay, if you want to hear more from Jim DiEugenio, he makes regular appearances on one of my favorite shows. It's called Black Op Radio with Leno Sanek. Black Op Radio, if you've never heard it, it's an important, fantastic show, and I recommend both the show and Jim's appearances highly. And you can hear episodes at blackopradio.com. And no, for everyone who thinks this is not a paid advertisement whatsoever. To be honest with you, I'm just not a competitive person, and I really believe in what they do. That's blackopradio.com. Links to purchase all 3 works by Jim DiEugenio can be found on the Midnight Rider News website, but if anyone would like to contact you or read your most current research online, what can they do and where can they go?
Well, just go to our website, kennedysandking.com, and if you want to contact me, there's a way you can reach me there through email, and it will go ahead and get through to me.
This has been Jim DiEugenio, author of Destiny Betrayed, The Assassinations, and Reclaiming Parkland, and he can be found at kennedysandking.com. Jim, thank you for being on the show tonight.
Sure, my pleasure.
And this is S.T. Patrick. I'm on the Midnight Rider News Show, and I'll be right back with some final thoughts. Tonight on episode 005, Jim DiEugenio showed us what a true researcher can be, should be, and is. It's really a statement on establishment control that we let the historical establishment decide who the so-called great historians of our era are. We let them trot out the familiar names, the darlings of the publishing companies, those who get hired to teach, or not teach, from the country's highest-ranked universities. But when you let the establishment choose their leaders, their heroes, and the standards by which someone can become either, you are relinquishing even more control over the discovery and flow of knowledge. Jim DiEugenio and others are absolutely great historians. They may never acquire the tenured emeritus status at an Ivy League university, and Random House may never fall all over themselves to grace their pens. The New York Times Book Review may never give them 5 stars, and Pulitzer may be a foreign word. But are there more important historians today than those like Jim DiEugenio who challenge the establishment in search of popular and unpopular truths? The next time a great researcher is named, stop. Stop and think not what he has been called, not where his or her work has been advertised, but what have they done? How have they changed the way you think? And how will they inevitably impact the future of truth movements across the world, not only today, but tomorrow? From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to S.T. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.